Look at her sitting there pretending she belongs with us. A cleaning lady's daughter who thinks marriage gives her class. Margaret's pale blue eyes fixed on the young black woman seated beside her son, her voice carrying across the room filled with Chicago's elite. You can dress her up, but you can't change what she is. A nobody who climbed into our world through my son's bed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of silverware as 30 of the city's most influential people watched in horrified fascination. Jasmine Blackstone, brilliant, composed, dignified Jasmine, slowly set down her wineglass with hands that trembled only slightly, her dark eyes never leaving her mother-in-law's face as she absorbed the public assassination of her character in front of people she had considered friends. That's enough, Mother, came a weak protest from somewhere down the table, but the voice linking conviction lacked the strength to truly defend the woman who bore the Blackstone name but would never be accepted into their world. But what none of them knew, what Margaret herself had never bothered to discover, was that the woman she had just humiliated in front of Chicago's elite wasn't the poor maid's daughter they believed her to be. Beneath Jasmine's quiet composure lay a secret that could destroy the Blackstone real estate empire with a single phone call, a hidden truth that would turn their world of privilege and prejudice upside down in ways they could never imagine. Jasmine Blackstone sat perfectly still, her spine straight despite the weight of 30 pairs of eyes boring into her, her hands folded in her lap as she processed not just the verbal assault, but the deeper betrayal of being reduced to nothing more than a racial stereotype in front of people who had shared her table for 3 years. The woman who had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton Business School, who had built a property development empire from a single apartment building, who secretly owned 40% of Chicago's downtown real estate, was being dismissed as worthless by people who had no idea they were sitting in buildings she owned. If you believe in the power of justice and the strength that comes from being underestimated, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see that dignity can never truly be stolen, and subscribe to Acts of Depth for more stories that remind us that the quietest people often carry the loudest thunder. The Blackstone family dinner had been a monthly tradition for over a decade, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and influence that served as much to intimidate as to celebrate. Tonight's gathering was particularly significant, a celebration of the family's latest real estate acquisition, a billion-dollar development project that would cement their dominance over Chicago's skyline for generations to come. Jasmine had arrived precisely on time, wearing a simple black dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, her natural hair styled in a way that was professional yet beautiful. She had learned over 3 years of marriage to navigate these events with careful precision, speaking when spoken to, smiling when expected, and enduring the constant microaggressions that came with being the only black face in a sea of white privilege. "Jasmine, dear," Margaret had said upon her arrival, the endearment dripping with false sweetness, "how lovely that you could join us. I wasn't sure if you'd be comfortable with tonight's guest list. So many important people from the business world. I know how overwhelming that can be for someone from your background." The comment was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Jasmine had simply smiled and thanked Margaret for her concern, her response so gracious that it made the older woman's cruelty seem even more pronounced by contrast. The dinner conversation had flowed around topics that deliberately excluded Jasmine: private school memories she hadn't shared, family vacations to places she had never been, business connections built through generations of inherited wealth. When she did attempt to contribute, her comments were met with polite but dismissive responses that made it clear her opinions weren't valued. "Oh, Jasmine," laughed Catherine Blackstone Wells, Margaret's daughter and a prominent socialite. "You're so sweet to try to understand business matters, but real estate development is quite complex. It's not like managing household staff or organizing charity events. Perhaps you should focus on the things you are naturally good at." The condescension was breathtaking in its casual cruelty, delivered with a smile that made it seem almost kind. Jasmine had nodded politely, her expression never changing, though inside she was calculating the value of the properties Catherine's husband managed. Properties that Jasmine actually owned through a network of shell companies, properties that generated the income that funded Catherine's lavish lifestyle. But it was the arrival of the evening's special guest that had triggered Margaret's most vicious attack. Senator Robert Hayes, a powerful politician whose support the Blackstone family needed for their latest development project, had been seated directly across from Jasmine. His presence represented millions of dollars in potential profits, and Margaret clearly viewed Jasmine's presence as a liability that needed to be managed. Senator Hayes, Margaret had said during the main course, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, I hope you'll forgive our family's diversity experiment. My son has always had a soft spot for charity cases, and sometimes his kindness gets the better of his judgment. The comment had been delivered with a laugh, as if it were a charming family quirk rather than a devastating personal attack. Senator Hayes had shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing the cruelty, but unwilling to challenge his powerful hostess. Other guests had exchanged glances, some looking embarrassed, others appearing entertained by the drama unfolding before them. Mother, came another weak protest from somewhere down the table, but again the voice lacked conviction. Jasmine didn't even need to look to know it was her husband, Thomas Blackstone, offering his usual half-hearted defense that satisfied no one and protected nothing. Oh, don't be modest, Thomas, Margaret had continued, warming to her theme. We all know the truth. Jasmine was working as a maid when you met her, cleaning offices in one of our buildings, if I remember correctly. It's quite the Cinderella story, really, though I'm not sure how it ends. The lie was so casual, so confidently delivered, that several guests nodded as if they had always known this version of events. Jasmine had never been a maid, had never cleaned offices, had never been anything other than a successful businesswoman who had chosen to keep her achievements private. But the truth was irrelevant when the lie served Margaret's purposes so perfectly. I think it's wonderful, Senator Hayes had said diplomatically, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. America is built on stories of people rising above their circumstances. Oh, absolutely, Margaret had agreed, her smile sharp as a blade. Though, of course, there's a difference between rising above one's circumstances and forgetting where one came from. Some people adapt beautifully to new environments, while others... She had let the sentence hang, her meaning unmistakable. Jasmine had continued eating her dinner with perfect composure, her movements graceful and controlled despite the verbal assault being conducted around her. She had learned long ago that responding to Margaret's provocations only provided more ammunition, that dignity lay in refusing to be drawn into the older woman's games. But inside, she was making calculations of a different sort. The development project they were celebrating tonight, the billion-dollar deal that would make the Blackstone family even wealthier, required permits that were controlled by the City Planning Commission. A commission whose chairman happened to be David Chen, Jasmine's business partner and closest friend, though none of the Blackstones knew of their relationship. The financing for the project came from Meridian Bank, whose board of directors included 3 people who owed their positions to Jasmine's recommendations. The construction contracts would be awarded by the City Council, where Jasmine's influence ran deeper than the Blackstones could imagine. Even the land itself, the prime downtown parcels that made the development possible, was owned by a consortium of investors that Jasmine controlled through her holding company. As Margaret continued her verbal assault, describing Jasmine as everything from ungrateful to out of her depth, Jasmine was quietly calculating the cost of the family's cruelty. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment of public humiliation was being added to a ledger that would soon come due. The evening's climax had come when Margaret rose from her chair, wine glass in hand, and delivered her final verdict with the casual cruelty that had defined the entire evening. The words about being just a poor black maid who got lucky had been designed to destroy whatever remained of Jasmine's dignity, to reduce her to nothing more than a racial stereotype in front of people whose respect she had spent years earning. But as Jasmine sat in the aftermath of Margaret's attack, surrounded by the uncomfortable silence of people who had witnessed something they knew was wrong, but lacked the courage to condemn, she felt something shift inside her chest. The woman who had endured 3 years of microaggressions and casual cruelty, who had absorbed every insult in the hope that patience and grace would eventually win acceptance, was gone. In her place sat someone who had finally understood that some people would never see her as anything more than what their prejudices allowed them to perceive. And that recognition, painful as it was, had also set her free. The drive home from the Blackstone family dinner passed in suffocating silence, the leather interior of Thomas's Mercedes feeling more like a tomb than a luxury vehicle. Jasmine stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, its glittering lights reflecting off buildings she owned but could never claim, while Thomas hummed softly to himself as if the evening had been nothing more than a pleasant family gathering. Mother was in rare form tonight, Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the casual dismissiveness that had become his trademark when discussing his family's treatment of his wife. You know how she gets when there are important guests. She just wants everything to be perfect. The explanation was so inadequate, so completely divorced from the reality of what had transpired, that Jasmine almost laughed. Here was a man who had just watched his mother publicly humiliate his wife, who had offered nothing more than token protests while she was reduced to a racial stereotype for the entertainment of Chicago's elite, and he was characterizing it as perfectionism rather than cruelty. Perfect, Jasmine repeated softly, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. Is that what you call what happened tonight? Thomas glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road, his expression showing mild irritation at her failure to simply move past the evening's unpleasantness. You're being too sensitive, Jasmine. Mother doesn't mean anything personal by it. She's just protective of the family reputation. The casual gaslighting was so complete, so effortless, that Jasmine realized this was how Thomas had always processed his family's behavior, not as cruelty that needed to be confronted, but as minor social friction that could be smoothed over with enough denial and rationalization. They pulled into the circular driveway of their Lincoln Park mansion, the imposing Georgian structure that had been Thomas's wedding gift to her, but that she had never been allowed to truly make her own. Every decoration, every piece of furniture, every detail of the house had been chosen by Margaret or Catherine, leaving Jasmine feeling like a guest in her own home. Inside, the house was dark except for the soft glow of accent lighting that illuminated the oil paintings of Thomas's ancestors, generations of Blackstone men who stared down from their gilded frames with the same expression of entitled superiority that their descendant wore so naturally. Jasmine climbed the grand staircase toward her private study, the one room in the house that Margaret had never been allowed to influence. But Jasmine's study was far from the decorative retreat that Thomas imagined it to be. Behind the locked door and beneath the carefully maintained facade of a wealthy wife's personal space lay the nerve center of an empire that dwarfed anything the Blackstone family had ever built. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time financial data from markets around the world, and the custom-built computer system hummed quietly as it processed millions of data points related to real estate investments, development projects, and property acquisitions. Jasmine settled into her chair and entered the complex series of passwords that protected her most sensitive files, watching as her screens came alive with information that would have shocked anyone who thought they knew her. Phoenix Holdings, the real estate investment firm she had built from nothing, now controlled assets worth over $23 billion. Her portfolio included properties in 47 cities, development projects on 3 continents, and controlling interests in 12 major construction companies. The irony was exquisite in its completeness. While Thomas spent his days playing the role of real estate mogul, attending meetings where he contributed little beyond his family name and inherited connections, Jasmine was actually building the future of urban development. The projects he took credit for were financed through her companies. The permits he assumed came through family influence were approved because of her relationships with city officials. The construction contracts that generated Blackstone profits were awarded by companies she controlled. But perhaps the most delicious irony of all was the secret that Thomas had never discovered, despite 3 years of marriage. Jasmine owned 47% of Blackstone Properties itself. When the company had faced a liquidity crisis 2 years ago, drowning in debt from overextended development projects and cost overruns, it had been Jasmine's money that saved it. She had purchased the company's debt through a series of shell corporations, then converted that debt into equity when the Blackstone family had no other options. Thomas believed his brilliant leadership had turned the company around, never realizing that his wife had been pulling the strings all along. The billion-dollar development project they had celebrated tonight, It existed only because Jasmine controlled the financing, the permits, the construction contracts, and even the land itself. The Blackstone family was building their legacy on a foundation that belonged entirely to the woman they treated as an unwelcome intruder. Jasmine pulled up the files related to tonight's dinner party, cross-referencing the guest list with her extensive database of Chicago's business and political networks. Senator Hayes's upcoming re-election campaign was being funded by donors who owed their wealth to investments managed by Jasmine's companies. The permits for the Blackstone development project were controlled by city officials whose careers she had quietly supported. Even the bank financing the project was led by executives who had been recommended for their positions by Jasmine herself. The beauty of her position was that none of them would ever connect their professional success to the woman they had watched being humiliated tonight. They would assume their achievements were the result of merit, connections, or simple good fortune. They would never suspect that the quiet black woman they had dismissed as irrelevant was the invisible hand that had shaped their careers and controlled their futures. But Jasmine's power extended far beyond real estate and politics. She had spent 3 years documenting every instance of the Blackstone family's racism, every casual cruelty, every moment of public humiliation. She had recordings of Margaret's private comments about keeping the help in their place. She had evidence of Catherine's embezzlement from the family foundation. She had proof of Thomas's tax evasion schemes and his use of company funds for personal expenses. When the time came to destroy them completely, she would have enough ammunition to ensure that their fall from grace was as public and humiliating as her own had been tonight. But more than that, she would have the satisfaction of knowing that their destruction came not from external enemies, but from the woman they had never bothered to truly see or understand. The soft chime of her secure phone interrupted her planning, and Jasmine smiled as she saw the caller ID. David Chen, her business partner and the chairman of the City Planning Commission, was calling from his office where he was reviewing the permits for the Blackstone development project. "I saw the news alerts about tonight's dinner," David said without preamble, his voice tight with anger. "Please tell me the reports are exaggerated." Jasmine's smile faded as she remembered Margaret's public assault, the casual cruelty with which she had been reduced to a stereotype for the entertainment of Chicago's elite. "They're not exaggerated. If anything, they're understated." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before David spoke again, his voice heavy with determination. "Then it's time, isn't it? Time to show them what real power looks like." Jasmine felt a moment of sadness for the woman she had been just hours earlier, the woman who had still believed that patience and grace could eventually win acceptance, that love could overcome prejudice, that dignity could triumph over cruelty. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some battles could only be won through strength, not surrender. "Yes," Jasmine said, her voice steady and calm. "It's time. Initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was the code phrase that would begin the systematic destruction of everything the Blackstone family had built, the careful dismantling of an empire that existed only because of Jasmine's hidden support. Within hours, permits would be revoked, financing would be withdrawn, construction contracts would be canceled, and political support would evaporate. As she ended the call and began implementing the first phase of her plan, Jasmine felt a sense of calm settle over her for the first time in years. Tonight had been the first domino fell exactly 48 hours after Margaret Blackstone's public humiliation of her daughter-in-law, though the family was too intoxicated by their own sense of superiority to recognize the sound of their world beginning to collapse. Thomas sat in his corner office at Blackstone Properties, feet propped up on the mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather, scrolling through congratulatory messages from colleagues who had witnessed what they called his mother's masterful handling of an uncomfortable social situation. The knock on his door interrupted his self-satisfaction, and his assistant Jennifer entered with an expression that immediately set off alarm bells in Thomas's mind. Jennifer had worked for the Blackstone family for 12 years, and in all that time, he had never seen her look quite so pale, quite so shaken, quite so reluctant to deliver whatever news she carried. "Mr. Blackstone," she began, her voice carefully controlled, "I've just received a call from the City Planning Commission. They're requesting an immediate meeting regarding the Millennium Tower project. Apparently, there's been some kind of complication with the permits. Thomas's feet hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the spacious office. What kind of complication? The permits were approved months ago. We're supposed to break ground next week. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she consulted her notes. According to Chairman Chen, there's been a review of the environmental impact assessments. Apparently, new concerns have been raised about the project's effect on the surrounding neighborhood. The commission is suspending all permits pending a full investigation. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, but before he could fully process their implications, his phone began ringing with the urgent tone reserved for emergency calls. Margaret's name flashed on the screen, and Thomas grabbed the receiver with hands that had begun to shake despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Thomas, thank God." Margaret's voice was tight with panic. "Have you heard about the bank? They're calling in our construction loans. All of them. They're saying there are irregularities in our financial statements. Questions about our ability to service the debt. This could destroy us." Thomas felt the room begin to spin as the magnitude of what was happening started to sink in. Two catastrophic setbacks in the span of minutes, both targeting the core of the family's business empire, both appearing out of nowhere like guided missiles aimed at everything they had built over 3 generations. "That's impossible," he managed to say, though his voice lacked conviction. "Our financials are solid. We've never missed a payment. We've been banking with Meridian for 40 years. "That's what I thought too," Margaret replied, her voice cracking with stress. "But they have documentation, Thomas. Internal memos, email chains, recorded conversations. Someone has been feeding them information from inside our organization. Someone with access to everything." The call ended abruptly, leaving Thomas staring at the phone in his hand as if it were a foreign object. Around him, the office that had always felt like a throne room suddenly seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. He tried to call Catherine, then his father's old business partners, then the mayor's office, but each conversation brought worse news. The Blackstone family's carefully constructed network of influence and protection was disintegrating in real time. Permits were being revoked, contracts were being canceled, political allies were suddenly unavailable to take their calls. The empire that had taken 3 generations to build was crumbling in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the building's executive parking garage, Jasmine sat in her Tesla watching the chaos unfold through the security cameras she had quietly installed throughout the building months earlier. Her tablet displayed a dozen different feeds showing Thomas pacing frantically in his office, Margaret screaming at her assistant over the phone, Catherine crying in the ladies' room as she tried to reach her husband's lawyer. The sight should have brought Jasmine satisfaction, but instead she felt only a cold, clinical detachment, like a surgeon observing the success of a particularly complex operation. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. It was about showing people who had built their lives on the systematic dehumanization of others that their power was an illusion, that their cruelty had consequences, that the woman they had dismissed as powerless was actually the architect of everything they thought they owned. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Phase 1 complete. The environmental review will take at least 6 months, assuming they can address the concerns we've raised. The bank has also received some interesting information about the family's offshore accounts. Are you ready for Phase 2? Jasmine typed back quickly, "Initiate Phase 2. It's time for the family meeting." The Blackstone family emergency meeting was called for that evening at Margaret's Beacon Hill estate, the imposing Victorian mansion that had served as the family's seat of power for over a century. Jasmine arrived precisely on time, her black dress simple but elegant, her demeanor calm despite the storm of accusations and recriminations that had been swirling around her all day. Thomas had spent the afternoon convinced that somehow, impossibly, his wife was connected to their sudden run of catastrophic bad luck, though he couldn't articulate how someone he considered powerless could orchestrate such sophisticated attacks on their business empire. The family gathered in Margaret's study, a room lined with legal documents and real estate awards that testified to decades of accumulated wealth and influence. Margaret sat behind her massive desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, while Thomas paced frantically and Catherine huddled in a corner chair, her usual arrogance replaced by genuine fear. "This is all connected," Thomas announced without preamble, his voice hoarse from hours of frantic phone calls. "The permit problems, the bank issues, the contract cancellations. Someone is orchestrating this. Someone with inside knowledge and serious resources." Margaret's pale eyes fixed on Jasmine with laser-like intensity. "And who do you think might have both the motive and the means to attack our family so systematically?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Jasmine felt the familiar weight of their collective suspicion settling on her shoulders. But this time, instead of shrinking under their scrutiny, she felt a surge of power that was almost intoxicating. They suspected her, but they had no idea of the true scope of what she was capable of, no understanding of the empire she had built, while they dismissed her as irrelevant. "Are you suggesting," Jasmine said quietly, her voice carrying a new edge that made everyone in the room pause, "that I somehow have the power to manipulate city planning commissions, major banks, and construction companies? That seems like quite an impressive skill set for someone you've always considered worthless." Thomas stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes wild with a combination of fear and rage. "Don't play innocent with me, Jasmine. This started right after Mother's dinner party, right after you were publicly exposed for what you really are. Maybe you decided to lash out, to try to hurt us the only way you could." "And how exactly would I do that?" Jasmine asked, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "What resources do I have? What connections? What power? According to all of you, I'm nothing but a maid's daughter who got lucky. So please explain to me how someone so powerless could bring down the mighty Blackstone family." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time since she had known them, Jasmine saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. They had spent so many years dismissing her, diminishing her, reducing her to nothing more than an unwelcome addition to their family tree, that they had never bothered to actually investigate who she really was or what she was capable of. Catherine spoke up from her corner, her voice shrill with hysteria. "Maybe she hired someone. Maybe she's been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to destroy us. Maybe everything about her has been a lie from the beginning." Jasmine smiled then, an expression so cold and calculating that it sent chills through everyone present. "You're absolutely right, Catherine. Everything has been a lie, but not the lie you think." She walked to Margaret's desk and placed a thick folder on its polished surface, the sound echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. "The lie isn't that I've been plotting against you. The lie is that you ever had any power to begin with." Margaret opened the folder with trembling hands, her face growing paler with each document she examined. Property deeds, stock certificates, bank statements, corporate filings, page after page of evidence that the Blackstone real estate empire belonged not to the Blackstone family, but to the woman they had spent years treating as an unwelcome guest in their own home. 47%, Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "I own 47% of Blackstone properties. I own the permits for your developments. I control the financing for your projects. I own the construction companies that build your buildings. I own everything you thought was yours." Thomas collapsed into a chair as if his legs had given out, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. "That's impossible. The company has been in our family for generations. My grandfather built it from nothing." "Your grandfather built a small construction company that went bankrupt in 1987, Jasmine corrected, her voice clinical in its precision. "I bought the assets, the name, and the legacy through a series of shell companies. Everything you think you inherited, I gave you. Every success you've celebrated, I made possible. Every dollar you've spent, I earned." Margaret's hands shook as she continued reading, her legal training allowing her to understand the complex financial structures that had hidden Jasmine's ownership for years. The development projects, the city contracts, the bank relationships, you controlled all of it. I controlled all of it, Jasmine confirmed, and now I'm taking it back. The room erupted in chaos as the full implications of her revelation sank in. Thomas lunged toward her, his face twisted with rage, but stopped short when he saw the expression in her eyes. Not fear, but a cold calculation that promised consequences he couldn't imagine. Catherine began sobbing hysterically, her world of privilege and entitlement crumbling around her. Margaret sat frozen behind her desk, her brilliant mind struggling to process the magnitude of her miscalculation. "You can't do this," Thomas whispered, his voice broken. "The family name, the legacy, the employees who depend on us, you'll destroy everything." "I'll destroy everything you built on lies and cruelty," Jasmine corrected. "But I'll save everything that actually matters, the projects, the developments, the jobs that depend on real work instead of inherited privilege. The Blackstone name will disappear, but the work will continue under new leadership. Better leadership." 6 months later, the boardroom of what was now Phoenix Development Corporation gleamed with morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Lake Michigan. The mahogany table that had once hosted the Blackstone family's arrogant proclamations now served a very different purpose, surrounded by some of the most innovative minds in urban development rather than entitled heirs trading on inherited wealth. At the head of the table sat Jasmine Washington. She had reclaimed her maiden name along with her power, her presence commanding the room not through intimidation or inherited privilege, but through the quiet authority that came from genuine expertise and hard-earned respect. The transformation had been swift and merciless, but also surprisingly constructive. The Blackstone family's carefully constructed world had collapsed entirely within weeks of her revelation. Thomas had been forced to declare personal bankruptcy when his assets were revealed to be nothing more than loans secured against company stock he didn't actually own. Margaret's legal practice had been suspended pending investigation into her role in covering up the family's financial irregularities, her reputation destroyed by evidence that Jasmine had been collecting for years. Catherine's husband faced federal charges for tax evasion and money laundering, while Catherine herself had been reduced to working as a real estate agent for a company that wouldn't even return her calls 6 months earlier. The irony was exquisite. The woman who had mocked Jasmine for her supposed humble origins was now experiencing genuine financial hardship for the first time in her privileged life. But perhaps the most poetic justice had been reserved for Senator Hayes, whose political career had been quietly destroyed through a whisper campaign that exposed his connections to the Blackstone family's corrupt practices. The man who had sat silently while Jasmine was humiliated at dinner now found himself facing ethics investigations and calls for his resignation, his political future as dead as his moral authority. "The quarterly results are extraordinary," announced Dr. Sarah Kim, Phoenix Development's new Chief Innovation Officer, as she presented data that would have been impossible under the Blackstone family's profit-driven leadership. "Our affordable housing initiative has created homes for over 15,000 families. Our green building program has reduced carbon emissions by 30% across our portfolio, and our community development partnerships have generated over $2 billion in economic activity in underserved neighborhoods." Jasmine nodded approvingly as she reviewed the reports that proved what she had always known, that real estate development could be both profitable and ethical, that business success could serve communities rather than exploit them, that wealth could be a force for positive change rather than a tool for maintaining inequality. Under her leadership, Phoenix Development had become the industry standard for responsible urban development, attracting the world's top architects and planners while generating profits that dwarfed anything the Blackstone family had ever achieved. The company's projects were featured in architectural magazines, studied in business schools, and replicated by developers around the world who wanted to prove that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive. "There's something else," Dr. Kim continued, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made everyone in the room lean forward. "The Chicago Housing Authority has approved our proposal for the Southside Redevelopment Project. If successful, it will be the largest affordable housing initiative in the city's history, providing homes for over 50,000 families while creating 20,000 permanent jobs." The irony was exquisite. The project that would become Jasmine's greatest achievement was being built on land that the Blackstone family had once owned, land they had planned to develop into luxury condominiums that would have displaced the very communities Jasmine was now serving. Their vision of profit over people had been replaced by something that proved business success and social responsibility could coexist. The meeting concluded with discussions of new sustainability initiatives, international expansion plans, and educational programs that would train the next generation of ethical developers. As the board members filed out, chatting excitedly about projects that would have been impossible under the old regime, Jasmine remained seated at the head of the table, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a vision finally realized. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Jasmine smiled as she read the sender's name, David Chen, who had become not just her business partner, but one of her closest friends, the aftermath of the Blackstone family's destruction. Turn on Channel 7, the message read. You'll want to see this. Jasmine activated the wall-mounted television and found herself watching a news report about Thomas Blackstone's latest humiliation. The man who had once commanded respect in Chicago's real estate circles was now standing outside a bankruptcy court, his expensive suits replaced by an ill-fitting outfit from a discount store, his arrogant demeanor replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had lost everything and couldn't understand how it had happened. Mr. Blackstone, a reporter called out, do you have any comment on the allegations that your family's real estate empire was built on fraudulent practices and illegal financial schemes? Thomas looked directly into the camera, and for a moment Jasmine saw a flicker of the man who had stood silently while his mother humiliated her 6 months earlier. But the arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. The dawning awareness that he had been playing a game whose rules he had never understood, against an opponent whose capabilities he had never bothered to assess. I have no comment, Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the noise of traffic and shouting reporters, except to say that sometimes the people you think you know best are the ones you don't know at all. The news report cut to footage of Margaret Blackstone being escorted from her law office by federal agents, her silver hair disheveled, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The woman who had spent decades building her reputation as a pillar of Chicago society was now facing criminal charges that would likely result in prison time, her legacy destroyed by the same evidence-gathering skills she had once used to advance her career. Jasmine turned off the television and walked to the window, looking out over the city that had once seemed so hostile, so determined to keep her in her place. Chicago's skyline stretched before her, its towers reaching toward a sky that no longer seemed like a ceiling, but like an infinite expanse of possibility. She thought about the dinner party that had started it all, about the moment when Margaret's cruelty had finally pushed her past the point of silent endurance. The woman who had sat quietly at that table, absorbing insults and betrayals while planning her response, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that true power didn't come from inherited wealth or social connections, but from the courage to use your abilities in service of something larger than yourself. The real estate empire she had built wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving that business could be a force for good, that success could be measured in communities served rather than profits maximized, that wealth could be used to lift people up rather than keep them down. Her phone rang, and Jasmine smiled as she saw the caller ID, Maria Santos, the director of a community center in one of the neighborhoods where Phoenix Development had built affordable housing. The center was thriving, serving families who had been displaced by gentrification and helping them build new lives in homes they could actually afford. Jasmine, Maria said, her voice thick with emotion, I wanted you to know that little Carlos, the boy whose family was facing eviction, he's